They laughed at her simplicity, not knowing they were standing inside her empire. The chandeliers above shimmered like frozen stars, casting golden reflections across the polished marble floors of the Grand Regent Hotel, where the city's most powerful names had gathered for what was whispered to be the most exclusive private gala of the year, an event where invitations were rarer than million-dollar deals and reputations were built or quietly destroyed over a single conversation. And as luxury cars lined the circular driveway outside, engines purring like contented beasts, the guests inside moved with practiced elegance, their designer gowns sweeping the floor, tailored suits fitting like armor, diamonds catching the light with every subtle turn of the head. Yet in the midst of all that curated perfection, one figure stepped through the glass doors without announcement, without spectacle, and without apology. Emily Carter wore a simple navy dress that fell just below her knees, her shoes modest, her hair tied back in a way that suggested practicality rather than performance. And for a brief moment, no one noticed her, not because she was invisible, but because she didn't fit the script they had already written in their minds about who belonged and who did not. She paused just inside the entrance, her eyes calmly scanning the room as if memorizing it piece by piece. The distant clink of crystal glasses, the low hum of calculated laughter, the subtle tension beneath every polite exchange. It was a world she knew intimately, though no one there could have guessed it from the way she stood quietly near the edge of the room, hands relaxed, posture steady, as if she had nothing to prove and no one to impress. But then came the first glance, sharp and deliberate, from across the room. Victoria Langston, draped in a silver gown that seemed designed to announce her presence before she even spoke, noticed Emily with the precision of someone trained to evaluate worth in seconds. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something she found unacceptable, and as she leaned closer to the group beside her, her voice carried just enough to be heard. Soft, but cutting. Interesting. I don't recall the guest list including charity cases tonight. A ripple of quiet amusement spread through the circle, a few polite smiles, a few raised eyebrows, the kind of reaction that masked cruelty behind etiquette. And just like that, Emily had been categorized, labeled, reduced, without a single word spoken on her behalf. Yet she didn't react. Not immediately. She simply adjusted her gaze, meeting Victoria's eyes for half a second longer than expected, not with defiance, but with something far more unsettling, composure. And in that fleeting moment, there was a subtle shift, something unspoken that made Victoria's smile tighten just slightly before she dismissed it entirely, turning back to her audience as if the matter had already been decided. Nearby, a waiter hesitated before offering Emily a glass of sparkling water instead of champagne, an unconscious decision shaped by the same assumptions now circulating through the room. And though the gesture seemed small, almost insignificant, it carried the weight of silent judgment. Yet Emily accepted it with a polite nod, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had seen this pattern unfold more times than anyone in that room could imagine. And while the laughter resumed, louder now, more confident, unaware of the quiet storm gathering just beneath the surface, the truth lingered in the air, invisible but inevitable, like the calm before something no one there was prepared to face, because what they saw was a simple woman standing alone at the edge of their world. But what they failed to understand was that she wasn't on the outside looking in. She was standing exactly where she intended to be, waiting, observing, and the night had only just begun. The laughter did not fade. It evolved, becoming sharper, more deliberate, as if the room had silently agreed on a role for Emily Carter without ever consulting her. And Victoria Langston, sensing the attention of her circle tightening around her, took a slow sip of champagne before stepping forward just enough to close the invisible distance between them, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each step measured, controlled, and meant to be noticed. "You seem a little lost," she said, her tone wrapped in politeness but edged with something colder, something practiced, and a few nearby guests turned subtly, their conversations pausing mid-sentence as curiosity began to ripple outward like a quiet current. Emily met her gaze again, steady, unhurried. "I am exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice calm, almost gentle, yet carrying just enough clarity to disrupt the rhythm Victoria had. intended, and for a fraction of a second, there was hesitation, not enough for anyone to openly acknowledge, but enough for Victoria's smile to sharpen rather than soften. "That is interesting," she said lightly, glancing at the others as if inviting them into a private joke. "Because this event is invitation only." The words hung in the air, delicate yet deliberate, and someone nearby let out a faint laugh, quickly masked behind a glass, while another guest leaned in just enough to catch every word, the energy shifting from casual amusement to focused scrutiny. Emily did not move, did not defend. She simply held her glass, her fingers relaxed around the stem, as if she had all the time in the world, and that calm began to feel out of place in a room that thrived on reaction. "I am aware," she said, her voice still even, and that answer, simple as it was, seemed to unsettle more than any protest could have, because it offered no resistance, no explanation, nothing for Victoria to dismantle. And so Victoria adjusted, her tone cooling further. "Then perhaps you can explain which of our hosts you are here with," she asked, the question framed as curiosity but delivered like a test, the kind designed not to discover truth, but to expose weakness. And the circle around them tightened, subtle steps inward, shoulders angling just enough to form a quiet audience, the room itself seeming to lean closer, waiting, measuring, anticipating the moment where composure might finally crack. But Emily only tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much to say, and then, with the same calm precision, she answered, "I am here for the same reason everyone else is." And again, there was no defense, no apology, just a statement that refused to fit the narrative being forced upon her. And this time, the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, because something about her refusal to play along had begun to shift the balance. However slightly, Victoria's expression held, but her eyes flickered, calculating, recalibrating, as if she could not quite place what was wrong with the picture. And in that moment, she chose escalation. "Security has been instructed to be very careful tonight," she said, her voice just loud enough now to ensure others could hear. "We would not want any misunderstandings about who belongs here." The implication landed exactly as intended, drawing a few more glances, a few more whispers, and across the room, a uniformed guard began to move, slow at first, then more direct, guided not by evidence but by expectation, and still, Emily did not react, her posture unchanged, her gaze drifting briefly past Victoria to the far end of the ballroom where a set of tall double doors remained closed, guarded, waiting, as if she were measuring something beyond the present moment, something the others could not yet see. And when her eyes returned, there was the faintest trace of something new, not anger, not discomfort, but quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And for reasons no one in that circle could quite explain, the air felt heavier, the laughter thinner, as if the room itself was beginning to sense that whatever they believed about her might not hold for much longer. But pride, once set in motion, rarely pauses for doubt, and Victoria, still convinced she controlled the narrative, lifted her chin slightly, ready to deliver the final dismissal, unaware that the ground beneath that certainty had already begun to shift. The guard's footsteps were quiet but unmistakable, the kind that carried authority without needing to raise a voice. And as he approached, the subtle hum of conversation around the room shifted again, conversations softening into whispers, glances sharpening with anticipation, because moments like this were not just about correction, they were about spectacle, about reinforcing an unspoken hierarchy that everyone present had learned to respect. And Victoria Langston, sensing the nearing conclusion of what she believed was a minor inconvenience, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, her posture relaxing just enough to signal control. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," she said smoothly, though her eyes never left Emily. "And I am sure security will be happy to assist." The guard stopped a few feet away, his expression professional, neutral, but his attention clearly directed at Emily, waiting for instruction rather than acting on impulse. And for the first time, a few guests leaned in a little closer, eager for the resolution, the removal, the quiet restoration of order. But Emily did not step back, did not offer explanation. She simply turned slightly toward the guard, her movements calm, deliberate, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. "Is there a problem, sir?" the guard asked politely, his tone respectful but firm, and for a brief second, all eyes shifted to her response. The room holding its breath in that peculiar silence that comes just before something irreversible. Emily met his gaze, not with defiance, but with quiet clarity. "No problem," she said softly. "Just a misunderstanding that will resolve itself shortly." And there was something in the way she said it, something steady, assured, that caused the guard to hesitate. Just enough to break the expected rhythm, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Victoria's expression tightened again, the smallest flicker of irritation crossing her features before she masked it behind composure. "I think it is quite clear," Victoria interjected, her voice sharper now, less patient. "This guest cannot verify her invitation." The words carried further this time, drawing even more attention, and across the ballroom, a few heads turned fully, conversations pausing entirely as the scene began to take center stage. And still, Emily did not rush. She did not scramble to prove herself. Instead, she reached into her small handbag with unhurried precision, retrieving a simple envelope, unmarked, unembellished, and for a moment, it seemed almost underwhelming compared to the grandeur surrounding it. She held it lightly between her fingers, glancing at it as if confirming something only she understood, before extending it toward the guard, who accepted it cautiously, opening it with careful hands, his eyes scanning the contents. And as he read, something shifted, subtle at first, a tightening of his posture, a slight widening of his eyes, not dramatic enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to signal that what he saw did not align with what he had been told. The room, still watching, sensed the change without understanding it, and Victoria, noticing the guard's unexpected pause, stepped forward again, her voice now carrying a trace of impatience. "Well," she prompted, "I assume that settles it." But the guard did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked up from the envelope, his gaze moving from Emily to Victoria, then back again, as if recalibrating his entire understanding of the situation. And when he finally spoke, his tone had changed, not louder, not softer, but unmistakably different. "Ma'am," he said carefully, addressing Emily with a level of respect that had not been there before. "Would you mind waiting here for just a moment?" And that single shift, that subtle change in address, rippled through the surrounding guests like a quiet disturbance in still water, confusion replacing certainty, curiosity replacing judgment. And Victoria's smile faltered, just slightly, as the script she had been following began to slip beyond her control, while Emily simply nodded once, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, as if this was merely another step in a sequence she had already seen unfold in her mind. And somewhere beyond the closed doors at the far end of the ballroom, movement stirred, unseen but inevitable, as the night began to turn in a direction no one in that room had prepared for. The shift in the guard's tone did not go unnoticed, not by the circle gathered around them, and certainly not by Victoria Langston, whose confidence had always relied on immediate compliance, on the predictable flow of power bending in her direction. But now that flow hesitated, fractured, and in that brief pause, the room itself seemed to inhale. Unsure of what came next, the guard stepped back half a pace, still holding the envelope carefully, as if it carried more weight than its plain exterior suggested. His radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a low murmur of voices exchanging information beyond the visible scene. And for the first time that evening, the control Victoria believed she held began to slip through her fingers, not dramatically, not loudly, but in subtle, undeniable ways. "Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice measured but no longer effortless, her eyes fixed on the guard as if willing him to restore the order she expected. But he did not answer her directly. Instead, his attention remained respectfully on Emily. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am," he said again, reinforcing the shift in tone, in status, in perception, and that single word, "ma'am," landed heavier than any accusation had before, because it reframed everything, and the surrounding guests felt it, even if they could not yet explain it. Whispers began to form at the edges of the circle, low and uncertain. "Did you hear that?" someone murmured. "Who is she?" Another voice followed. curiosity replacing the earlier amusement, and Victoria's smile, once sharp and certain, now held a strain beneath its surface. "I believe you are overcomplicating a simple situation," she said, her words carefully chosen, but the edge beneath them unmistakable. "This is a private event," and before she could continue, the distant double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, not abruptly, but with quiet authority, the kind that did not demand attention yet commanded it effortlessly. And one by one, heads began to turn, conversations dissolving into silence as a man stepped through, his presence cutting cleanly through the atmosphere of the room. He was older, composed, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke not of fashion, but of position, of permanence, and he did not rush, his pace steady, deliberate, as he moved across the marble floor, his eyes scanning the room with quiet recognition, and then settling, unmistakably, on Emily Carter. The effect was immediate, though subtle, a ripple of awareness spreading through those who recognized him. A few guests straightened instinctively. Others exchanged glances, their earlier confidence beginning to falter, because this was not a man who attended events casually. This was a man who defined them. And as he approached, the guard stepped aside without being told, lowering his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Mr. Whitaker," someone whispered under their breath, the name carrying weight even among those who had not spoken it aloud, and Victoria felt it, that shift, that unspoken recognition moving past her, around her, redirecting the attention she had so carefully gathered. Her posture stiffened just slightly, her control narrowing, focusing, as if she could still reclaim the moment if she acted quickly enough. But the man did not look at her, not yet. His attention remained fixed on Emily, and when he finally stopped a few feet away, the room held its breath again, not out of anticipation this time, but out of something deeper, something closer to realization. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm, respectful, and unmistakably familiar. "We have been expecting you." And in that instant, the silence that followed was not empty. It was absolute, the kind that erases every whisper, every assumption, every quiet judgment that had been made just moments before. And though no one spoke, the question passed through every mind in that room at once, not as curiosity, but as dawning clarity, because the way he addressed her, the way he stood, the way the room itself seemed to rearrange around that single acknowledgement, it told a story far more powerful than anything that had been said before. And Emily, still composed, still steady, inclined her head slightly, not surprised, not flustered, but as if she had simply reached the moment she had been waiting for all along. While across from her, Victoria Langston stood very still, her expression frozen in place, caught between disbelief and understanding, as the foundation of everything she had assumed began to quietly, irrevocably collapse. The name hung in the air like a quiet verdict, and no one moved, not immediately, because the weight of recognition takes time to settle, especially in a room built on appearances. Mr. Whitaker did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in it was already understood, and as he stood before Emily Carter with calm familiarity, the truth began to unfold in the only way it ever does in such rooms, slowly at first, then all at once. Victoria Langston's breath caught, almost imperceptibly, her mind racing to reconcile the image she had constructed with the reality now standing in front of her. Because James Whitaker was not merely a guest, he was the chief legal advisor to Langston Holdings, a man whose presence alone signaled decisions of consequence. And if he was addressing Emily with that level of respect, then the implications were not small. They were catastrophic to every assumption she had made. "I apologize for the delay," Mr. Whitaker continued, turning slightly, so his voice carried just enough for those closest to hear. "The board has been waiting for your arrival to begin the final proceedings." And that word, board, sent a ripple through the crowd. A few guests straightened instinctively. Others exchanged quick, uneasy glances, because this was no longer a social event. It was something else entirely, something far more significant. And Emily, who had remained composed through every glance, every whisper, every quiet insult, now stepped forward with the same calm presence, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. "There is no need to apologize," she said softly. "I prefer to observe before I engage." And that single sentence landed with quiet precision, reframing her silence not as uncertainty, but as intention. And in that moment, the entire narrative shifted. The simple woman they had dismissed was no longer an outsider. She was the one who had been watching them, evaluating them, understanding them, while they had been too busy judging her to realize it. The room went completely still, the earlier laughter now a distant memory replaced by something heavier, something closer to unease. And Victoria felt it more than anyone, because the structure she relied on, the hierarchy she navigated so effortlessly, was now inverted in a way she could not control. Her voice, when she finally spoke, lacked the effortless confidence it once held. "Emily Carter," she repeated slowly, as if saying the name might somehow restore her footing. "I was not aware that you were involved in this evening." But even as she spoke, she knew the words were insufficient, too late, and Emily turned to face her fully for the first time, her expression calm, but no longer neutral. There was clarity there now, a quiet resolve that had nothing to prove and everything already established. "That is understandable," Emily replied, her tone polite, measured. "You were focused on appearances," and the sentence, delivered without accusation, carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it did not challenge Victoria, it revealed her, and the room felt it. The subtle shift from judgment to realization, from certainty to discomfort. Mr. Whittaker stepped slightly to the side, giving Emily the space that now clearly belonged to her, and as he did, a few more figures near the back of the room adjusted their stance, their attention sharpening. Recognizing what others were only beginning to grasp, "Shall we proceed?" he asked quietly, and Emily gave a small nod, her gaze moving briefly across the room, taking in every face that had so quickly defined her, dismissed her, measured her worth based on nothing more than what they could see. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the truth had arrived not with noise, but with undeniable presence. And in that silence, the lesson began to settle, not as something announced, but as something experienced, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. As Emily Carter stepped forward, no longer at the edge of the room, but at its center, where she had belonged all along. And that was the moment the world around her finally understood what dignity looks like when it does not ask for recognition. It simply waits for truth to reveal it. The shift was complete, though no one dared to name it out loud, because in rooms like this, power does not announce its arrival with noise. It reveals itself through silence, through the way people stand, the way they look, the way they suddenly remember their place. And as Emily Carter moved forward beside Mr. Whittaker, the crowd parted instinctively, not out of courtesy, but out of recognition, the kind that comes too late to change first impressions, but just in time to alter behavior. Conversations that once carried confidence now dissolved into murmurs, glasses paused midair, and the same eyes that had measured her moments ago now avoided direct contact. Unsure of what they might reveal, Mr. Whittaker gestured subtly toward the elevated platform near the center of the ballroom, where a long table had been arranged beneath a cascade of crystal light, a place reserved not for guests, but for decision-makers. And as Emily approached it, her steps remained unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing in the room had shifted at all, yet everything had. The quiet authority she carried did not demand attention, it redirected it, and when she reached the table, several individuals already seated their rows immediately, their movements precise, respectful, acknowledging not just her presence, but her position. "Miss Carter," one of them said, his voice formal, almost careful, "we are ready to proceed whenever you are." And again, that word, ready, echoed with meaning, because it confirmed what many were only beginning to understand. This evening had never been about social display. It had been about transition, about ownership, about control passing from one hand to another, and Emily, standing at the center of it, was not a participant. She was the reason it existed. She placed her glass down gently, untouched, and glanced briefly at the documents arranged before her, her eyes scanning them with quiet familiarity, before lifting her gaze to address the table. "Let us begin," she said, her voice calm, clear, and in that moment, the room seemed to settle into a different rhythm, one defined not by status symbols, but by authority, real authority, the kind that does not rely on appearance. And across the floor, Victoria Langston stood exactly where she had been left, her expression no longer composed, no longer certain, but carefully controlled, as if she were holding together a structure that had already begun to crack. The realization was no longer forming. It had arrived, complete and undeniable. Emily Carter was not just connected to Langston Holdings. She was the heir, the one whose approval would shape decisions, whose presence redefined the hierarchy everyone else operated within. And that truth carried consequences far beyond a single conversation, far beyond a single mistake. Because in a world built on perception, being wrong about someone like Emily was not just embarrassing, it was costly. The whispers grew louder now, but softer in tone, no longer mocking, but cautious, analytical. "She is the Carter heiress," someone said under their breath. "I thought she lived abroad." Another replied. "No one said she would attend tonight." And piece by piece, the story they should have known assembled itself in hindsight, each detail adding weight to the silence that now surrounded them. And still, Emily did not look back. She did not acknowledge the shift, because she did not need to. Her focus remained forward, on the table, on the decisions unfolding, on the responsibilities that had always defined her long before anyone in that room decided who she was based on a glance. And that was what unsettled them most. Not her wealth, not her title, but her composure, the fact that nothing about her had changed, only their understanding had. And as the meeting began, voices low but precise, documents turning, agreements forming, the rest of the ballroom stood suspended in quiet observation, witnesses to a transformation they had not anticipated, one that did not rely on confrontation or correction, but on something far more powerful, the quiet, undeniable exposure of truth. And in that truth, the earlier laughter felt distant, almost unrecognizable, as if it had belonged to a different room, a different time, one that no longer held any power at all. The meeting did not rush. It unfolded with a precision that felt almost surgical. Each page turned, each signature placed, each quiet exchange carrying more weight than the loudest conversation earlier that evening. And as Emily Carter listened, occasionally speaking with calm authority, the distinction between presence and power became undeniable, because while others in the room had arrived to be seen, she had arrived to decide, and that difference settled over the crowd like a slow, irreversible truth. Mr. Whitaker stood slightly behind her, not directing, not interrupting, but observing with the quiet assurance of someone who understood exactly how this would end. And around the table, the board members leaned in, their tone respectful, their language careful, no longer performing for one another, but aligning with her, seeking confirmation, waiting for her approval. And every time she responded, whether with a single nod or a measured sentence, the direction of the evening adjusted accordingly, the structure of authority rebuilding itself in real time around her presence. And across the ballroom, the guests who had once filled the space with confident laughter now stood in a different kind of silence, one shaped by awareness rather than expectation. They watched, not openly staring, but unable to fully look away, because what was happening at that table was no longer abstract. It was defining. It was rewriting everything they thought they understood about influence, about status, about who truly held control. And among them, Victoria Langston remained still, her posture upright, her expression carefully maintained, but the tension beneath it visible to anyone who cared to look closely. She had not moved closer, had not stepped away, as if caught between two decisions, neither of which felt safe anymore, because approaching now meant acknowledging what she had failed to see, and leaving meant accepting that she no longer belonged at the center of the narrative she once controlled. And so she stood, watching, recalculating, her mind racing through every word she had spoken, every glance she had given, each one now returning with a clarity she could not ignore. While at the table, the conversation reached a natural pause, a moment where all documents had been reviewed, all positions clarified, and the outcome, though not yet spoken aloud, had already taken shape. Emily's hand rested lightly on the final document, her fingers still, her gaze steady as she looked across the table, meeting each set of eyes in turn, not with challenge, but with quiet expectation. And one by one, the members nodded, their agreement not forced, but understood. And in that moment, the room felt it again, that shift, that silent confirmation that something had been finalized, something that extended far beyond the boundaries of that single evening. Emily signed, the pen moving smoothly across the page, the motion simple, almost understated, yet carrying the full weight of transition. And when she placed it down, there was no applause, no announcement, just a stillness that felt heavier than any celebration. Because those who understood did not need it explained. They could see it in the way the board members straightened, in the way Mr. Whitaker allowed himself the faintest nod, in the way the air itself seemed to settle. And for the rest, the realization came more slowly, piece by piece, through whispers, through glances, through the gradual understanding that the person they had dismissed had just become the most important figure in the room. And then, without urgency, Emily rose, her movement drawing attention not because it demanded it, but because it carried meaning, and for the first time since she had entered, her gaze moved beyond the table, sweeping across the room, not searching, not judging, but acknowledging. And as her eyes passed over the gathered guests, conversation stopped entirely, glasses lowered, shoulders straightened, because now they were not observing her, she was observing them, and the balance, once invisible, had completely reversed, and somewhere within that silence, the weight of every earlier word, every quiet laugh, every dismissive glance, returned, not as accusation, but as consequence, settling into the space between them, where it would remain long after the evening had ended. No one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the weight of what had just unfolded had settled too deeply for casual words to carry. And as Emily Carter stood at the center of the room, her presence no longer questioned, no longer misunderstood, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more reflective, the kind of silence that forces people to confront themselves rather than others. And slowly, almost reluctantly, movement began to return, a glass lifted here, a breath released there. But the energy had changed, permanently, because now every glance carried awareness, every whisper carried restraint, and every person in that room understood, whether they admitted it or not, that they had witnessed something they could not undo. And among them, Victoria Langston finally moved, her heels sounding softer now. Against the marble floor, her pace measured, not with confidence, but with careful intention. As she approached Emily, the distance between them no longer symbolic, but real, and as she stepped closer, those nearby instinctively gave way, not out of respect for her, but out of recognition of the moment unfolding. Victoria paused just a few feet away, her posture still composed, but the certainty that once defined her now replaced with something more restrained, more deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice was lower, controlled, stripped of the effortless superiority it had carried before. "Miss Carter," she began, choosing her words with visible care, "it seems I owe you an apology." And though the sentence was simple, the effort behind it was not, because in a room like this, apologies were rarely about acknowledgement. They were about recalibration, about attempting to restore balance after misjudgment. But Emily did not respond immediately. She regarded Victoria with the same calm presence she had carried all evening, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the moment undeniable. And in that pause, the room leaned in again, not for spectacle this time, but for understanding, because what Emily said next would not just address Victoria, it would define the meaning of everything that had happened. "There is no need for that," Emily said finally, her voice soft, but clear enough to carry. And for a brief second, confusion flickered across Victoria's face, because this was not the response she had prepared for, not the resolution she expected. But Emily continued, her tone calm, almost reflective. "You made a decision. Based on what you saw," she said. "That is something many people do." And the words were not harsh, not accusatory, but they carried a quiet truth that settled deeper than any confrontation could have. Victoria nodded slightly, though the movement felt incomplete, as if she understood the words, but not yet their full weight. And Emily's gaze shifted briefly beyond her, acknowledging the others who stood within earshot, who had participated not with words, but with silence, with agreement, with quiet judgment. "The difference," Emily added, her voice steady, "is whether you choose to learn from it." And there it was, not a reprimand, not a dismissal, but something far more lasting, a reflection placed gently into the room, allowing each person to see themselves within it. And for a moment, no one moved, because the truth did not arrive as a blow. It arrived as clarity, and clarity has a way of lingering, of settling into places people often avoid. Victoria lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, a small, almost imperceptible shift that spoke louder than any defense could have. And around them, the room remained still, not out of obligation, but because something had changed, something deeper than status, deeper than wealth, something rooted in the quiet understanding that respect is not granted by appearance, nor secured by assumption. It is revealed through character. And as Emily turned away, not to dismiss, but simply to continue forward, the space she left behind felt different, heavier with awareness, lighter with truth. And in that moment, no one dared to laugh, no one dared to whisper, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through power, not through force, but through presence. And the room went silent in a way it never had before, not from shock, but from understanding. The night did not end with applause, nor with celebration, but with something far more lasting, a quiet transformation that lingered in the air long after the final signatures had been placed and the last decisions confirmed, because what had unfolded within the walls of the Grand Regent Hotel was not simply a transfer of authority, it was a revelation, one that stripped away the illusions people carried about power, about worth, about the assumptions they built so easily and trusted so completely. And as the guests began to move again, their conversations returning in softer tones, their laughter more measured, there was a noticeable difference in the way they carried themselves, a subtle awareness that had not been there before, as if each person had been reminded that appearances, no matter how polished, could never fully define reality. And across the ballroom, small groups formed and dissolved, voices lowered, eyes occasionally drifting toward the center where Emily Carter had stood, now no longer the focus of scrutiny, but the quiet standard by which everything else was being measured. And though she did not seek attention, it followed her in a different way now, not with curiosity, but with respect, the kind that does not need to be announced, because it is felt. And as she spoke briefly with members of the board, her tone remained the same, composed, deliberate, unchanged by the shift in how others perceived her, as if the entire evening had simply revealed what had always been true, rather than creating something new. And that, more than anything, unsettled those who had misjudged her, because it meant the mistake had not been in the moment, it had been in them, in the way they chose to see, or more accurately, in the way they chose not to see. And among them, Victoria Langston stood apart, not isolated, but reflective, her earlier confidence replaced with a quiet introspection that did not seek to justify, but to understand, her gaze no longer scanning for approval, but fixed inward, replaying each detail with a clarity that only hindsight provides. And for the first time, the room she once navigated so effortlessly felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had, even if only slightly, even if only enough to recognize the cost of assumptions made too quickly. And as the evening gradually moved toward its close, the grand displays of wealth that once defined the atmosphere seemed less significant, the glitter of diamonds less convincing, the sharp tailoring of suits less authoritative, because something more meaningful had taken their place, something quieter, something that could not be worn or displayed, only carried. And that was the understanding that true presence does not demand recognition. It earns it through consistency, through character, through the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you are regardless of who is watching. And as Emily prepared to leave, her steps as calm as when she had arrived, the path before her opened naturally, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had finally found its place. And when she reached the doors, she paused only briefly, not to look back in triumph, not to confirm what had changed, but simply to move forward, as she always had, leaving behind a room that would remember this night not for its luxury, not for its exclusivity, but for the moment it was reminded of something far more important, that dignity does not announce itself, it reveals itself, often in the quietest ways, and those who recognize it too late are left not with regret alone, but with the opportunity to see differently, if they choose to take it. And as the doors closed behind her, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of a lesson learned without being spoken, the kind that stays long after the lights fade, long after the conversations end, long after the night itself becomes memory. Because that was the evening when a room full of certainty was humbled by a single truth, that respect is never defined by what you see, but by what you are willing to understand.